Have you ever experienced that hollow, deafening silence when he suddenly withdraws, leaving you to starve for the very attention you once took for granted? You sit there staring at a cold screen, drafting 1,000 desperate messages you'll never send, wondering what you did to deserve this emotional exile. But here is the brutal, counterintuitive truth. Your frantic attempt to be heard is exactly why you have become invisible to him. In the high-stakes game of attraction, your misplaced empathy has become his permission slip to disrespect you. Today, I am going to teach you why ignoring him is the only way to finally be heard, and how the sovereign gaze will transform you from the woman who begs for a crumb into the queen who decides who sits at her table. This is not just advice, it is your cure for the silence. We must begin by dissecting one of the most magnificent yet deeply destructive traits of the deeply conditioned good girl: your boundless empathy. You have likely been taught to believe that your endless capacity to understand, to nurture, and to forgive is your absolute greatest asset in securing a man's lasting devotion. However, in the unforgiving and highly practical realm of relationship psychology, this very empathy is frequently weaponized, not necessarily by him, but by you against yourself. You use your profound emotional depth to construct a comfortable fortress of excuses for his entirely unacceptable behavior, effectively blinding yourself to the reality standing right in front of you. Let us examine a rather painfully common scenario. He suddenly goes completely silent for the entire weekend, or he snaps at you with unwarranted coldness over a minor inconvenience. Instead of calmly observing this disrespect and gracefully stepping back, your mind immediately goes into overdrive to draft a brilliant legal defense for him. You tell yourself he is merely overwhelmed with pressure at the office, or perhaps temporarily triggered by some unresolved past trauma that you feel uniquely qualified to heal. Rather than enjoying your Saturday evening with a captivating book and a crisp glass of wine, you spend hours anxiously operating as his unpaid, highly invested therapist. What you fail to realize is the brutal message this continuous accommodation sends to his subconscious mind. By constantly translating his blatant disrespect into mere exhaustion or stress, you are actively doing the emotional heavy lifting that he, as a grown gentleman, should be managing entirely on his own. You are unknowingly teaching him that his poor behavior will always be met with a warm, comforting blanket of forgiveness, provided there is a slightly tragic excuse attached to it. He quickly learns that your boundaries are remarkably flexible, heavily dependent on his current mood, rather than anchored in your own unshakable standards. A true high-value woman firmly refuses to operate as an emotional rehabilitation center for inconsistently behaving men. She understands that while everyone experiences difficult days, a man of genuine substance manages his emotional baseline without using his partner as a convenient punching bag. She categorically does not lower her velvet rope simply because the man standing outside claims to have had a rather demanding week. You must firmly grasp that true sovereign empathy requires holding someone to a high standard, not continuously shrinking your own expectations simply to accommodate his laziness. Continuing endlessly justifying his shadows does not fix him. It merely drains your premium energy and significantly lowers your perceived value in his eyes. Yet this misplaced empathy frequently leads us directly into an even more perilous psychological trap. What occurs when you actively witness him displaying this exact toxicity towards other people but you mistakenly assume that your profound love has somehow magically insulated you from his true nature. This brings us to a rather fascinating and ultimately devastating illusion of exclusivity. Having addressed the perilous trap of misplaced empathy, we must now dissect a rather intoxicating delusion, the illusion of exclusivity. It is a deeply romanticized yet fundamentally flawed notion that your presence in a man's life possesses an almost miraculous curative property. You observe him speaking ruthlessly about his former partners, or perhaps acting with casual cruelty towards his colleagues, yet you feel a warm, misguided sense of security. You quietly convince yourself that because he has not directed this venom towards you, you are the grand exception to his rule. This is a brilliant, albeit dangerous trick of the ego. You sit there watching him expertly manipulate a business associate or lie effortlessly to a friend, and instead of feeling a profound sense of alarm, you feel dangerously special. You genuinely believe that your love, your unwavering patience, and your sheer radiance have somehow entirely domesticated the beast. But let me offer you a rather bracing dose of reality. From a purely strategic standpoint, a man's character is never a flexible circle that conveniently reshapes itself depending on who is standing in the room. Character is an unyielding straight line. Observe him incredibly closely when the stakes are low, for that is precisely when the charming mask slips. The absolute disdain he shows a waiter who brings the wrong order, or the callous, detached way he discards an ex-girlfriend's memory, is not a minor anomaly. It is a highly accurate preview of coming attractions. He is merely presenting his best behavior to you, whilst you remain strictly useful, perfectly accommodating, and pleasantly submissive. The very second you inevitably step out of line, or dare to enforce a boundary, that exact same ruthlessness will be swiftly and expertly aimed directly at you. A woman who operates with a truly sovereign gaze understands that a man's shadows are not entirely separate from his light. They are intrinsically woven into his daily fabric. She does not blindly fall in love with his imagined potential, whilst actively ignoring his highly visible red flags. Instead of proudly basking in the false glow of being the chosen one, she quietly and analytically observes how he operates in the dark, precisely when he believes absolutely no one of consequence is paying attention. After all, being the sole survivor in his path of relational destruction is hardly a prize worth striving for. True exclusivity is earned through consistent, undeniable integrity, not through a temporary convenient suspension of his toxic traits solely for your benefit. Ignoring these glaring inconsistencies requires an exhausting amount of mental gymnastics, completely blinding you to the actual danger lurking just beneath the surface. You tell yourself that these minor transgressions are merely isolated incidents, desperately hoping that what you currently see is the absolute worst of his behavior. But what exactly happens when you finally realize that this casual, everyday disrespect is merely the tip of a much more devastating blade? Following the stark realization that character is an unyielding line, we must address your rather foolish, albeit deeply human habit of negotiating strictly with the surface. When you inevitably catch him in a seemingly insignificant lie or experience a remarkably subtle moment of blatant disrespect, your immediate instinct is to desperately pray it is merely an isolated error. You carefully compartmentalize the infraction, treating it as a minor superficial scratch on the highly polished veneer of your relationship, rather than a gaping hole in the hull. You successfully convince yourself that you have now seen the absolute worst of him, neatly filing the incident under forgivable mistakes. However, let us be impeccably clear about the clandestine nature of deceit. True disloyalty and calculated manipulation fundamentally never operate exclusively on the surface. What you are currently witnessing is merely the sharp, visible tip of a rather cold and unyielding blade. If a man possesses the sheer audacity to confidently display 10% of his disrespect directly to your face, you can be absolutely certain there is a staggering 90% lurking just beneath those dark, uncharted waters. To assume otherwise is to willfully ignore the basic, unforgiving laws of human psychology, substituting solid strategy for entirely fragile hope. Consider the rather tedious scenario where you discover a mysteriously deleted message or catch him continuously engaging in harmless banter with a female colleague. Instead of calmly confronting the chilling reality of his wandering attention, you exhaust yourself attempting to monitor his digital footprint, playing the utterly exhausting role of an amateur detective. A woman operating from a place of true sovereignty categorically refuses to put on a metaphorical diving suit to meticulously explore the freezing, murky depths of his deception. Rather than wasting a perfectly good Saturday morning interrogating a grown man, she simply books herself a spa day and quietly mentally checks out. A high-value woman implicitly understands that she is the undisputed captain of her own magnificent vessel, and she never deliberately sinks her own ship merely to accurately measure the terrifying size of the iceberg. The very moment she detects the undeniable creeping chill of consistent disrespect, she does not demand a highly dramatic explanation or initiate a lengthy, exhausting negotiation regarding his poor choices. She smoothly and gracefully alters her course, completely and permanently severing his access to her premium time, her energy, and her radiant presence. She recognizes that ruthlessly protecting her peace is vastly superior to satisfying a morbid curiosity about his profound flaws. Yet despite possessing this fundamental protective logic, why do so many fiercely intelligent, accomplished women continuously choose to ignore these remarkably obvious ship-sinking realities? Why do you stubbornly insist on sailing directly into the hurricane, tightly clutching a fundamentally broken compass, simply because you have already sailed halfway across the ocean with him? The answer does not lie in a sudden lack of intellect, but rather in a deeply ingrained cognitive distortion fueled by a terrifying silent panic. We must now turn the spotlight onto the most blinding and destructive force of all, the suffocating grip of scarcity that heavily skews your every judgment. Why exactly do fiercely intelligent, wildly successful women continuously choose to ignore these remarkably obvious, glaringly apparent facts? It is a fascinating case of profound cognitive dissonance, entirely rooted in the suffocating grip of pure scarcity. You actively filter out his increasingly dark, unacceptable behaviors simply because your underlying terror of being alone is currently vastly outweighing your own self-respect. You are quietly suffering from the classic sunk cost fallacy, stubbornly clinging to a spectacularly bad investment purely because you have already spent so much premium time desperately trying to make it work. Instead of gracefully cutting your losses, you find yourself frantically attempting to salvage a thoroughly mediocre connection out of sheer panic. You convince yourself that starting over is utterly exhausting, preferring the familiar, lukewarm disappointment of his presence to the supposedly terrifying expanse of your own brilliant solitude. Rather than treating a quiet Friday night alone as a luxurious opportunity to pour a gin and tonic and finally finish that brilliant novel, you view it as a grim punishment. You are fundamentally allowing the irrational fear of an empty calendar to dictate the very standard of how you permit a grown man to treat you. Let me be brutally honest with you. The most intoxicating, undeniable power of the dark feminine archetype is the complete and utter absence of this fear. You will only ever possess the sharp clarity to perceive his brutal reality when you fully accept that losing a distinctly average man is not the tragic end of your world. It is, in fact, merely a highly necessary, rather refreshing spring cleaning of your own magnificent palace. Until you are entirely willing to push your chair back and walk away from the table without a single backwards glance, you will continually negotiate from a position of profound, glaring weakness. True, unshakable security does not miraculously stem from expertly avoiding the harsh truth, nor from desperately manufacturing eloquent excuses for his chronic inadequacies. It stems entirely from the cold, calculated courage to look the reality of his character dead in the eye without blinking and decisively refusing to lower your price. When you finally remove this heavy, desperately woven blindfold of scarcity, you stop frantically auditioning for his inconsistent attention and simply reclaim your sovereign throne. You begin to understand that a man's absence is frequently a far greater blessing than his painfully fragmented, half-hearted presence. Embracing this ruthless clarity entirely transforms the dynamic. You are no longer the anxious, accommodating participant, but the untouchable architect of your own reality. By mastering this sovereign gaze, you not only permanently filter out the noise, but you effortlessly command a level of respect that simply cannot be faked or negotiated. Yet, deeply understanding this profound psychological shift within yourself is merely the beginning of your absolute transformation. The truly fascinating question now remains: how exactly do you begin to weaponize this newfound clarity to permanently alter the rules of the entire game in your absolute favor? So, before you close this video and step back into the rather chaotic reality of modern dating, I have a somewhat probing question for you to ponder. What is the single most ridiculous, desperately creative excuse you have ever fabricated to justify a man's profoundly unacceptable behavior? Confess it in the comments below. Consider it a highly necessary shedding of your old fragile illusions. And if you are quite finished with settling for emotional crumbs and are entirely ready to master the dark, fascinating psychology of relationships, I strongly suggest you subscribe to Destiny's Decree and actively turn on your notifications. After all, a true queen never leaves her psychological education to chance. Until next time, keep your gaze perfectly sovereign and your standards entirely unyielding.